Hi, this is Kate Karlovich.
And I'm Hayes Minnick, and you're listening to Jack of All Lobbyists,
a podcast about the white-collar corporate and government crimes surrounding the Jack Abramoff casino lobbying scandal.
White-collar crime initially was defined by sociologist Edwin Sutherland in 1939 as, quote, a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation.
However, our definitions for white-collar crime vary and are vastly different than 80 years ago. With the rise of big government and big money came big crimes.
And those big crimes led to offense-based definitions created by the United States Department of Justice. The Bureau has defined white-collar crime as, quote, those illegal acts which are characterized by deceit, concealment, or violation of trust and which are not dependent upon the application or threat of physical force or violence. Individuals and organizations commit these acts to obtain money, property, or services, to avoid the payment or loss of money or services, or to secure personal or business advantage.
These offense-based definitions from the Department of Justice have provided clarity, consistency, and credibility since 1989. This provides the ability for law enforcement officers to follow the procedure and produce the same results each time. Those results can then reliably be reported to the Uniform Crime Report or the National Incident-Based Reporting System. These reporting systems have limitations and flaws, just like Jack Abramoff.
So, before we get into it, Kate, we may want to define some of the legal statutes not only Jack, but other individuals were charged with in the course of this case. All of these definitions comes from class definitions by Dr. Holly Ningard and sections of the United States Code. Fraud is the intentional perversion of the truth for the purpose of inducing another person or other entity in reliance upon it with something of value, or to surrender a legal right.
Conspiracy to commit honest services comes from 18 U.S. Code, Section 1341, 1346, Subset 2, commonly referred to as honest service fraud, is a type of federal mail or wire fraud in which a defendant is prosecuted for using the mail or wire services for the purpose of executing a scheme to defund another of the intangible right to honest services. Wire fraud. 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, whoever having devised or intending to devise any scheme or artifice to defraud or for obtaining money or property by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, representations, or promises, transmits or causes to be transmitted by means of wire, radio, or television communication in interstate or foreign commerce.
Well, tax evasion is a little bit more simple and a lot more complicated all at the same time. Section 26 of the U.S. Code, subsection 7201, is the attempt to evade or defeat taxes, which is what a large majority of the charges are surrounding upon. And conspiracy, in Section 18 of the U.S. Code, subsection 371, is if two or more persons conspire either to commit any offense against the U.S. or to defraud the U.S. or any agency thereof in any manner for any purpose, and one or more of such persons do any act to effect the object of that conspiracy, each shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 5 years or both.
Bribery is the offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting of anything of value, a bribe, gratuity, or kickback, to assuage the judgment or action of a person in a position of trust or influence. Section 18 U.S. Code, Section 203, compensation to members of Congress, officers, and others in matters affecting the government.
And counterfeiting and forgery is the altering or copying or imitation of something. Filing a false statement is illegal under Section 26 of the U.S. Code, subsection 7206, which is contributing to fraud and false statements. Additionally, many people committed obstruction of justice, which is illegal under Chapter 73, Section 18 of the U.S. Code.
Finally, we have corruption. Corruption involves a breach of public trust and/or abuse of position by federal, state, or local officials and their private sector accomplices. By broad definition, a government official, whether elected, appointed, or hired, may violate federal law when he or she asks, demands, solicits, accepts, or agrees to receiving anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of their official duties.
So, Kate, just who is Jack Abramoff, and what did he do to be involved in a scandal so huge it was coined by one of the 24 co-conspirators, Kevin Ring, as the Enron of lobbying?
Well, Jack Allen Abramoff, at the age of 49, pled guilty on January 3, 2006 to one count of conspiracy to commit honest services, fraud involving public officials, and fraud involving Abramoff's clients. One count of honest service fraud involving public officials, and one count of tax evasion. Abramoff was a lobbyist with Greenberg Traurig from January of 2001 to March of 2004 after lobbying with Preston Gates Ellis and Rubelas Meads from 1994 until 2001.
However, it was not until his lobbying for Greenberg Traurig in March 2001 where Jack turned from lobbyist to criminal. From 2001 to 2004, Abramoff led and participated in criminal conspiracies that resulted in tribes running million-dollar deficits, affecting not only their livelihood, but their people's health and education. Abramoff was the jack of all lobbyists, but for none of the right reasons.
At just 40 years old, Jack was the talk of Washington town and began lobbying for Native American tribes at Greenberg Traurig after great success in the 90s with Preston Gates Ellis and Rubelas Meads. First working with the Choctaw Indians in Mississippi, Abramoff quickly became the champion for Native Americans everywhere after influencing legislation that would ban taxes on Native American casinos.
Ultimately pitting these casinos against each other and inciting tribal Cold Warfare. But where does a guy like Jack Abramoff get his start? After trying his hand in the movie industry and actually writing and producing the film Red Scorpion with his brother, he turned to lobbying in the middle of 1994. In the beginning, he was the picture-perfect lobbyist, but shortly thereafter, with some help from his old college buddies, Abramoff began his descent into the lobbying rabbit hole.
While serving as chairman of the College Republicans at Brandeis University, he became good friends with Majority Whip Tom DeLay, President of Americans for Tax Reform Grover Norquist, and first executive director of the Christian Coalition Ralph Reed. Tom, Grover, and Ralph are the gang that bestowed Jack Abramoff with the nickname Casino Jack.
The four of them also recruited Michael Scanlon, John Boehner, Newt Gingrich, and Bill Paxton to what would be known as the K Street Project. Their mission: house as many Republicans and top Washington, D.C. lobbying firms on K Street as possible.
Does the K stand for anything?
Well, I wish corruption started with a K, but unfortunately doesn't. You see, as a Republican, Jack Abramoff agreed with Bush about many things, including the start of a new world order. He was determined to be a part of that and had promised K Street a new world order.
And oh, a new world order on K Street they found. In the 90s, Washington was home to about 10,000 lobbyists, but by 2005, there were 36,135 lobbyists in Washington, and those were just the lobbyists that were actually registered.
You see, Jack's first instance of trouble in paradise occurred in 2001 with the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana. They hired Abramoff and Scanlon's lobbying firm, Capital Campaign Strategies.
Jack was specifically working with DeLay's former communications director, Michael Scanlon, to aid them in the reintegration of their gambling agreement with the state of Louisiana, charging them way more, even for highly rated DC lobbyists. Jack's motto soon became,
"What they don't know won't hurt them." What the tribe didn't know was that Abramoff was sneaking extra cookies out of the cookie jar, if you know what I mean.
No, what do you mean?
Well, the stress and Jack's waistband started to grow in 2001 while hiding that he was taking cuts from the tribe's and Scanlon's firm, Capital Campaign Strategies.
Worried for his clients, Casino Jack came to the rescue after successfully and somewhat secretly lobbying politicians in Texas to enact a one-year ban from 2001 to 2002 on gambling. This resulted in the Tigua, another one of Jack's clients' casinos, closing.
In an effort to show the Tigua tribe that Jackass was actually trying to help him, he made a pitch to oppose the ban he just quietly passed from the Coushatta in the later months of 2002. Without their knowledge, Abramoff took the Tigua's $4.2 million and spent it on a golfing trip to Scotland, with Ohio Representative Bob Ney and his staff trying to tack on a gaming rights amendment to an election reform bill.
Just so Jack doesn't look all bad, He did try to convince Ney to oppose the ban in order to give the Tigwa tribe their gambling rights back, but his efforts went unnoticed and the deal fell through. But, as the story would tell, Casino Jack strikes again. He decided not to inform the Tigwa tribe of the outcome and continued to charge them for his and Scanlon's services by basically just telling them, yeah, it's coming, don't worry, I've got it under control. All the while mocking Native Americans, calling them morons, monkeys, and troglodytes in emails with Scallion.
Over the next 4 years, Casino Jack really showed his true colors. Between June 2001 and April 2004, the Mississippi Choctaw paid Scanlon $14,765,000, of which about $6,365,000 went to Abramoff.
Between March 2001 and May 2003, the Louisiana Choctaw paid Scanlon $30,510,000, of which about $10,944,000 went to Abramoff.
And between June of 2002 and October 2003, the Saginaw Chippewa paid Scanlon $3.5 million, of which about $540,000 went to Abramoff.
In March 2002, the Tigwa of F.J. Paso, Texas, paid Scanlon $4,200,000, of which about $1,850,000 went to Abramoff.
Total amount in money of the 6 tribes, the 4 mentioned, plus the Agua Caliente band of the Coahuila and the Pueblo Sandia of the California branch, paid to Capital Campaign Strategies between 2001 and 2004 $66,369,500.
Abramoff had to keep his business ventures separate from Capital Campaign Strategies because he couldn't risk being tied to all these kickbacks. Because none of this money was reported to the government, little of it was taxed as personal income. None of it was regulated. All of it was in addition to approximately $20 million that tribes paid over the counter to Abramoff while he was at Preston Gates and Greenberg Traurig.
You just threw a lot of numbers at me, and as we all know, sociologists aren't the best at math, especially in their head. So how much money was involved, all told?
Well, as a former chemist, I can tell you I'm okay at math. So in total, at least $90 million together involving half a dozen members of Congress.
So who was it that broke the news and when?
In the fall of 2003, veteran reporter for the Washington Post, Susan Schmidt, blew the case wide open.
You see, Schmidt had been given an inside lead from an unidentified lobbyist that Abramoff's tribes were paying 10 to 20 times as much as other lobbyists.
I wonder if Casino Jack ever found out who the lobbyist was that toppled his house of cards.
Well, you see, she worked secretly on the story until she was able to talk to Abramoff, who on the record said that, quote, "The bottom line is that my firm delivers. We provide expensive services in an expensive industry, and we get the job done," end quote.
Schmidt also asked on the record if he had a financial stake in Scanlon's companies, and he said no, but we all know now that that was an obvious lie.
Congressman from Virginia Frank Wolf asked the FBI to open investigations into Indian gambling, but it was ultimately Senator John McCain who sat on Committee for Indian Affairs that called for hearings on this matter.
McCain officially launched a probe into Abramoff and Scanlon on February 26, 2005 with help from the Senate Commerce Committee.
Shortly thereafter, in February 26 of 2005, Jack Abramoff admitted he failed to disclose his relationship with Michael Scanlon and he resigned from Greenberg Traurig. Shocker, huh?
Finally, on August 11, 2005, Jack Allen Abramoff was officially arrested. A Florida grand jury indicted him and one of his co-conspirators, Adam Cadan, who essentially turned himself in. Abramoff was formally charged with wire fraud and conspiracy in Florida.
But there was still something fishy in the Florida water.
By September 29, 2005, the Senate Indian Affairs Committee started the first hearing on the probe for truth. Abramoff immediately began pleading the fifth and continued to do so, until a few months later on January 3, 2006.
You see, Abramoff appeared on Constitution Avenue at the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The one-time Uber lobbyist pled guilty to fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to bribe public officials. He did, however, agree to pay restitution to the 4 tribes, the Choctaw Indians, Coushatta, the Agua Caliente, Coahuila, and the Saginaw Chippewa, in the sum of $25 million, along with an additional $1.7 million in back taxes.
The next day, he appeared in Miami federal court and pled guilty to charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. This time, his plea deal involved the minimum under federal guidelines of 5 years and 10 months in jail, along with agreeing to pay $21 million to the 2 tribe leaders they defrauded in Sun Cruise. He had 90 days from sentencing to surrender himself. Ultimately, Abramoff served 4 years of his 6-year sentence and was released on December 3rd of 2010.
You see, during his own trial and conviction, 24 other individuals were charged with having a part in this scandal. To start off bidding, we have Adam Cadan, who pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud, for which he served 35 months.
Todd Bollinger worked for Abramoff and pled guilty to showering congressional aides with meals, gifts, and was sentenced to 30 days and fined $2,000.
Roger Stillwell was the staffer in the Department of the Interior under Bush who pled guilty of filing a false financial statement and received 2 years probation and a $1,000 fine.
Stephen Grills was the former Deputy Interior Secretary for the Bush administration, and he pled guilty to obstruction of justice. Grills also perjured himself to the Senate committee about his adversarial ties to Abramoff on behalf of Indian tribal clients.
David Safavian was the Bush administration's former top procurement official and was sentenced to 18 months in prison in October 2006 for obstruction of justice.
Our favorite man, Bob Ney, Ohio Republican congressman, pled guilty in September of 2006, receiving 2.5 years in prison for taking bribes from Abramoff, like the lavish golf trip to Scotland. Ney roped in his former chief of staff, Neil Volz, William Heaton, and Thomas Hart. He eventually resigned from Congress a short time afterwards.
Italia Federici, co-founder of the Council of Republicans for Environmental Advocacy, pled guilty to tax evasion and obstruction of justice and was sentenced to 4 years probation and $77,243 in restitution.
Jared Carpenter was vice president of the Council of Republicans for Environmental Advocacy and ultimately pled guilty to income tax evasion. He was sentenced to 45 days in prison along with 4 years of probation after his release.
Mark Zacharies was a former aide to U.S. Rep. Don Young of Alabama. He pled guilty to conspiracy and admitted to accepting tens of thousands of dollars worth of gifts, along with participating in the golf trip to Scotland with Abramoff's team in May. In exchange, he performed official acts on the lobbyists' behalf.
Kevin Ring was a former staff member to John Doolittle of California and was convicted of 5 charges of corruption. In October of 2011, he was sentenced to serve 20 months in prison.
James Harney was a former U.S. Senate aide. He admitted to bribing Trevor L. Blacken, an aide to U.S. Senator Kit Bond, with meals, concert passes, and tickets to the opening game of the 2003 World Series at Yankee Stadium. He pled guilty to using wire communications to defraud taxpayers of congressional aides to honest services.
And don't worry, Trevor Blacken got what was coming in too. He ended up pleading guilty to not reporting $4,100 in gifts from lobbyists in return for helping clients of Abramoff and his associates. Not only did he receive those World Series tickets, but he was also privileged enough to get meals and strippers as a part of these gifts.
So I know these names probably don't mean a lot to you, but you'll know this guy for sure. Michael Scanlon, the former staff member of Tom DeLay, pled guilty to committing bribery in the course of his work for Abramoff.
Tony Rudy, also a former staff member to Tom DeLay, and pled guilty to conspiracy.
John Albaugh, a former chief of staff to Ernest Istook of Oklahoma, pled guilty to accepting bribes.
The Deputy Chief of Staff in the Criminal Division of the Justice Department, Robert E. Coughlin, pled guilty to conflict of interest after accepting bribes from Abramoff.
Horace Cooper, sounds like a villain from a Disney movie in my opinion, but was actually a former Labor Department official with the Bush administration and aide to U.S. Representative Dick Armey, pled guilty to falsifying a document in which he failed to report receiving gifts from Abramoff.
Ann Copeland was a former aide to U.S. Senator Thad Cochran and pled guilty to taking more than $25,000 worth of concert and sporting event tickets in return for helping Abramoff. But hey, at least they were diverse, right?
That's true. And Roger Stillwell was a former Interior Department official and honestly got the short end of the stick when it comes to his conviction. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge for not reporting hundreds of dollars worth of sports and concert tickets that he received from Abramoff. Luckily, though, in January 2007, he was sentenced to 2 years probation.
And in case you weren't counting, here's number 24. Fraser Verusio was a former Transportation Department official and was found guilty of conspiracy and accepting bribes. His punishment was 1 day in jail, followed by 2 years probation and a $1,000 fine.
We'd also like to note that Tom DeLay did not get convicted of any charges, but did resign from Congress because of the scandal.
So Hayes, what's your opinion on these charges, specifically with Abramoff?
Well, Kate, I think in today's day and age, the fact that Casino Jack served about 4/5 of his sentence in prison is quite impressive.
Why is that?
Well, considering the judge received over 300 requests for leniency, and with Jack being such a smooth talker, it's interesting that he served time at all. But I guess when you're stupid enough to put your crimes in writing through emails with your buddies, you get what's coming.
So you're saying that you think these sanctions were imposed on Jack were too lenient?
You see, when the mandatory minimums for his crimes were more than the time he actually served, yeah, I would say so. But what else is new for rich white men? All in all, it seems like Jack hasn't learned his lesson.
What makes you think he hasn't learned his lesson?
Well, now that he's out of prison, he's back in the business of untarnishing his beautiful silver reputation in lobbying.
Wait, what for?
Lobbying reform, of all things. It seems like Jack doesn't realize, or rather even care, that he hurt Native Americans, since he continues to say, quote, "No one bled, no one died. What's the big deal?" End quote.
The big deal is summed up pretty well by Senator Nighthorse Campbell of Colorado. The chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee said, quote, "I am horrified by what I believe these men and their accomplices pulled off in the deterrent of the tribes and their members. By manipulating tribal elections and installing people favorable to their greedy ends, they engineered a situation and enriched themselves, all the while holding these same Indian people incredibly low guard."
I also remember Senator Campbell serving some piping hot tea before the committee was officially adjourned directly to the offenders. Quote, "For 400 years, people have been cheating Indians in this country, so you're not the first one. You are the problem, buddy, of what's happened to American Indians."
What I don't think Jack ever cared about was the fact that he was hurting hundreds, if not thousands, of American Indian families by stealing their money and stripping them of their jobs in his scheme to pit these casinos against each other. Then again, maybe he was just blinded by money and the power and fame, and it was all getting to his head, and, just being the Jack of all lobbyists. But when it really comes down to it, do you think Jack was just a bad apple, or do you think there's a bigger, more systematic problem?
Absolutely. Jack himself in his memoir says that he, quote, "would take what happened in my life and try to learn from it and use it to educate others."
In the end, it's the lobbyists that make these decisions that force them into the light of white-collar crime, but it's the people in Congress that accept them. Lobbying itself is a risky game to play and has to be played responsibly. But you would hope that elected members of our government would know when something smells fishy. Blame can be poured on both sides for this case. Jack can't blame anyone but himself for the deals he orchestrated, and the 24 other members involved can't blame anyone but themselves for taking those deals.
Time has passed since Casino Jack lost all of his chips and watched the house of cards he built fall. But until something is done, Washingtonians will stay on K Street, at the scene of the crime, forever rebuilding their house of cards and vying to become the Jack of all lobbyists.